Welcome. We're going to call the West Ada School Board District meeting in order. First item up is the Pledge of Allegiance. Would everybody please stand? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Clerk Newbold, it's been a little while since we've done this, but is there any additions or adjustments to the agenda?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent Bubb, I will be attaching the patron comments tomorrow morning after we compile them. That's the only thing that I will be adding to the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, first item up is the superintendent's update. So,
Madam Chair, Trustees, thank you very much. It's a great first week and a half of school for West Ada School District. It obviously came with several challenges. It was great to have students back in class. You could feel the excitement of the school year. I want to say thank you to our students, masks or no masks. It was great to see students working together regardless of where they were at, masks or no masks. I was able to visit 18 schools in the past week and see students working together, see students in the cafeterias together, see students on the playgrounds together, and a variety of learning opportunities, which was amazing. I want to say thank you to our teachers for working really, really hard in preparation for a solid start to the school year. Our administrators, there's a lot that goes on in the summer that people don't know about. I will just tell you that people always ask when I was an administrator or a teacher, oh man, it's so nice to have summers off. I'm going to tell you, summers are some of the most difficult times for our administrators and our teachers. And so just planning for that, I know there's a lot that goes into that. So I want to say thank you to them. I want to say thank you to our classified staff. Our classified staff really are the cog that makes this entire machine go. And so it's been, it was really nice to see them working hard for our kids and knowing the planning that goes into this. I want to acknowledge our board. Our board's been really, really supportive of our schools, supportive of me and my position, but also supportive of our educational goals of moving forward with some math goals and making sure that we're addressing learning loss situations. And so I want to say thank you to them. COVID-19 update. Current case numbers as of when I looked at it just probably a little bit ago. We have 149 student cases, active cases of COVID-19 that have been identified, 20 staff cases, over 500 students in isolation, and over 500 students in the quarantine release program. That release program allows them to stay in class if they are wearing a mask. The Central District Health and Ada County health officials have identified the COVID-19 transmission alert level in Boise and Ada counties as red, and report hospitalizations are rising at the fastest rate since the pandemic began among all age groups, including youth. Our local hospital expects to face crisis standards of care in the next coming days. Northern Idaho hospitals just went into this method of care due to a severe shortage of staffing and available beds in the northern area of the state, caused by a massive increase in patients with COVID-19 who require hospitalization. Student quarantines throughout the district are increasing in number at various school sites. As a result, school administrators and nurses district-wide are dedicating a large portion of their time contact tracing, diverting them from their daily obligations and instructional leadership. A significant shortage of qualified substitute teachers is being experienced nationwide. As an organization, West Ada experiences an average of 35% unfilled substitute jobs daily. The introduction of COVID-19 pandemic into our schools has forced West Ada School District to be agile in our planning and safety protocols. Going into the current school year, our goal was to begin as normal as possible with flexible mitigating measures in place that allowed our students to stay in school 5 days a week. Unfortunately, the Delta variant is wreaking havoc on our state, local community, and is substantially disrupting our daily operations. As cases and hospitalizations are near record levels, West Ada has deemed it necessary to review our COVID-19 safety plan and make the following alterations. Starting on Friday, September 10th, to protect staff, students, and community from spread of highly contagious Delta variant of the coronavirus, West Ada School District is temporarily requiring all staff, students, and visitors to wear masks when in classrooms and when social distancing is not possible, thus suspending all mask opt-outs. Medical exemptions on file with students' school nurse or special services in the form of a 504 plan or an IEP will remain in place. West Ada School District will review the mask requirement on September 24th to determine whether the mask requirement can be lifted and opt-outs restored if an extension in the mask requirement is necessary. The determination to lift or extend the temporary mask requirement policy will be based on COVID-19 data from school district and local healthcare system. As one of the largest organizations in the Treasure Valley, as well as state, we believe that we have a public health obligation. The virus has evolved, and so must we. Implementing a mask requirement for students and staff is one way that West Ada can make a positive contribution to the community. While we are not convinced that this will solve the COVID-19 pandemic, as leaders, we feel obligated to do our part. We are committed to working with our families, students, and staff to keep schools open while prioritizing the health of our school communities. Your support and encouragement for our children during this challenging time, as well as your compassion and respect for one another, is greatly appreciated. We appreciate your commitment to your children and thank you in advance for your support of the temporary mask requirement while we make every effort for our students to remain in school. As a school community, I know we are all dedicated to providing the best for our children. I thank you for your continued encouragement, love, acceptance, and open-mindedness as we tackle these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Bubb, would you be okay if the board asks some questions?
Madam Chair, trustees, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Is there any questions from trustees? Trustee Ozuna.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Bubb, and thank you for the acknowledgement to our incredible team for getting us started in such a good way this year. I think that great things are happening in West Ada, and I hope that people are seeing what's taking place in our classrooms. Related to COVID, I just want you to know that I completely agree and support with your decision on this. I do think that our community needs help, and anyway, I'm supportive of moving in this direction. I did miss, though, the date when we were going to revisit that.
Madam Chair, Trustee Ozuna, I have September 24th, so that'll be 2 weeks really from tomorrow that we'd revisit it. We'd look at our data again.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again, Dr. Bubb.
Trustee Kloppenstein.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I was curious, Dr. Bubb, I appreciate you doing this. I think this is well needed, especially the numbers are getting very high, especially for elementary. So I was curious, what are your, do you have a kind of a number guideline that you're looking at that would be part of your revisit on the 24th?
Madam Chair, Trustee Kloppenstein, I think there's a lot of different variables when it comes to this. Obviously, we want to look at spread within our schools, but we also need to look at spread within our community. One of the things that we've really been looking at, yesterday as I looked, there was 4 ICU beds in the state. That's more of a community concern. That's not to say that our kids are going to be in those beds. The bigger concern is where are our kids and how are they going out into the community, and are they bringing this into the community? One of the things that brings some promise is when you look at some of the states that had this early on, Florida, I looked at Georgia yesterday. Some of these states that had this early on are starting to see a steady decrease, and my hope is that we'll see a steady decrease in our numbers, and we'll work closely with our hospital community to make sure that that we're not becoming part of that problem.
Thank you. Trustee Kofelt, you're on the phone. Did you have any questions, comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I would like to make a couple comments. And one, I know we mentioned at our last board meeting that we gave Dr. Bubb the authority to be flexible and move as needed. And so because of that, I fully support Dr. Bubb's recommendation. I appreciate that it's a 2-week recommendation, and we'll continue to review. I think you said, Madam Chair, at our last meeting that, our North Star is to keep our kids in school. We tried to implement a policy, a plan that provided flexibility, it provided choice, and it was a little less restrictive than we had originally talked about, and that has not worked to keep our kids in the school, and so I fully support an option that will keep our kids in school. I will say though, and I know that the cases occurring in the state of Idaho are growing. Our healthcare professionals in the north are experiencing a crisis healthcare situation, but I think it is important to point out that this is involving adults. The American Academy of Pediatrics updated their report as of September 7th. 0.1 to 1.9% of all COVID cases in the hospital are related to children. 0.03% of COVID case deaths are related to children. Our hospitals, Dr. Sousa said it at our last meeting, are inundated with unvaccinated adults. So I support us doing our part to try to minimize if our children are taking this home to their adults, then by all means I support that. I'm a little less than optimistic that by putting, I think right now our opt-out number is about 36% of our kids, which is roughly 14,000 kids. I'm not quite sure in our community where there's not a lot of support for mask wearing or vaccinations. I'm not quite sure how putting 14,000 more of our kids is going to somehow alleviate the strain on our healthcare system. But with that being said, I hope I'm wrong. And for me, I support Dr. Bubb on this strictly on the fact that what we're doing right now is not keeping our kids in school. And unless we were to alter our quarantine plan or something of that nature, which I know there's not support for now, continuing down this path that we're doing now just isn't working. So I support Dr. Bubb in this, and I hope it achieves the results that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a couple just operational questions, two, so I'll just give them. So we have, so we're going to check back in 2 weeks, and then if we're not where we're at, we'll continue on as kind of our thinking, and if we are, we'll come back to probably where we were at today, prior to today. Is that okay? And then second question is, super appreciate the update here at the board meeting. What's our kind of communication plan for media, parents, community, that kind of stuff?
Madam Chair, I constructed a response and a release to our parents that will go out. It may, I don't know where Char is at, but it may be on its way out right now. So we were waiting to say it in a public board meeting, and then it'll go out to all parents today.
Thank you. I had something that I was going to use later, but I'm going to use it now, and it's a quote that I think really hits the mark today about you. It says, "A leader takes people where they want to go, but a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go but ought to be." And I think that you're doing that for our district today, even though it's hard, really hard. I also think that we talk about whether or not COVID impacts kids, but we're talking about whether or not they get sick. But today, West Ada lost a teacher, and there are a ton of kids impacted by that teacher's loss from COVID. So to say that they're not showing up in the hospital is the only impact of COVID on our kids is not accurate. And we have to look larger than just when our kids get sick. We also look at the social and emotional well-being of those things. And I appreciate the fact that we're recognizing that our community is not just about whether or not our kids get sick. It's about how our community works together as a system to help combat this virus. And if we can't work together as a system, if we're going to all be on our own, we're never going to beat it. So I appreciate you looking at it that way. Thank you very much.
We are never going to beat it.
Listen, this is not a public comment period.
We're never going to beat it. You guys are destroying our kids.
So, Would you please? Thank you. All right. Is there any other comments, questions on this? Thank you. All right, we'll move on to revised policy 602.2, the academic freedom and teaching controversial issues policy. Mr. Myers, there you go.
All right, thank you. Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent Dr. Bubb. Prior to your second review of policy 602.2, academic freedom and responsibility in teaching controversial issues, I'd like to update you on the work that was done between the first reading and this evening. Members of this policy committee, composed of board members, building principals, district leadership, and teachers, met and revised the draft policy after the first reading. Revisions were based on input from the board received at the last meeting where this policy was introduced. The teacher input survey was resent that evening to instructional staff, and 240 total responses were submitted. These were also used to revise the policy you have before you now for the second reading. Additionally, once the policy is approved, a plan is in place to review the policy each year with all staff through our yearly mandatory employee training. Along with that, through our curriculum instruction department and specific to teachers of subjects who may encounter this policy more often, there is training planned the first 2 weeks of October. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions and suggestions for revision for the committee, knowing that as a committee, we already have our next meeting scheduled to discuss your input and prepare a revised draft for the third and final reading.
Thank you. Is there any updates or input to the policy? Trustee Kofelt, I wanted to give you an option because I know you can't see the room.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I'm good. Thank you.
Trustee Buffy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to thank Mr. Myers and the Policy Review Committee for making those edits that we discussed during the first reading. And I also just wanted to say that I really appreciate the tie-in of the student and staff harassment and bullying policies into this. So thank you for all of your hard work.
Thank you. This is what a second reading should look like. All right. Well, with that, we'll move on to revised policy 403.80, the Title IX non-discrimination policy. Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Bubb. We too, after our last meeting, met as a committee, went through the changes. There actually was not a lot of significant changes to the policy based on the comments that were made in the first meeting. We based the only change that was made is on page 4, right there, and it really refers to the policy we had originally drafted had people identified as investigators. It's difficult to have names identified in policies, period, because then when names change, we have to change policies. And that's not part of the regulations and not a requirement. So the committee decided that we should remove that as long as it didn't meet anything with the regulations, and it did not. And so we've removed that. And that's the only change that we made. I would stand for any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Trustee Ozuna.
I think this is a difficult policy in general to get, or a topic to get through, and you guys have done the committee has done a really nice job organizing this in a way that it's easy to follow. And if I was a parent trying to get through this, I would know exactly where to go. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts, I just have one question. We still had to leave your name in the policy. Is that a requirement?
Madam Chair, yes, that's a requirement.
Okay, thank you. All right. No other feedback. This will be ready for third reading. And next up on the agenda is the levy discussion. You going to take that? You're going to go there? Okay, great.
Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Bubb. It's easier for me to see the same thing you're seeing on the screen, so I think I'll just do it from here if that's okay. So tonight we're here to talk a little bit about supplemental levy. In particular, we're talking about when we would choose to run one, and that's at the board's decision. So things we're going to discuss tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the supplemental, what it is. We're going to talk about some timing options associated with supplemental levy. There is some supplemental levy language as well that I know you've seen in the past, so I'll hit on that along with some uses. The other discussion topic we were going to have tonight was around the emergency levy. And at this time, the district is actually recommending we don't move forward with that. So you won't see a lot of slides on that. We feel like we've gotten some good news so far with some dollars we've associated with ESSER and ECF, and so we think we'll be able to have some flexibility with our ESSER funding. And so with that, we're recommending that we don't request an emergency levy at that time and limit the burden on taxpayers. So a little shorter conversation than we would have normally had. So the supplemental levy. Recommendation right now is to continue or propose the levy as we currently have it, which is $14 million annually for 2 years. Currently, the levy accounts for roughly 5% of our general fund operating budget. I put on the side there some impacts if the supplemental levy were not to pass. So as you would imagine, 5% of our budget, a substantial chunk, roughly 85% of our budget is staffing and salaries and benefits. And so there would be an impact on our FTE should that not happen, should that not get approved, along with some things that we talked about last time when the supplemental levy didn't pass the first round, allocations to schools for supplies, and then we'd still have some further reductions we would still need to make as part of that. So that gives you a little picture of what it is that 5% goes for, what it is the $14 million are used for. So why are we talking about it right now? Because we have to get some language to the county if we want to have it on the November ballot. And so that is due to the clerk by September 13th, and not our clerk, but actually the clerk at the county. So they are eager, if we're going to move forward with that, for them to get language. So what I tried to kind of identify for you is what are some positives and what are some advantages and disadvantages of running it in November or choosing to run it at a later ballot. The next time would be March. So you can see that obviously some advantages of running it and getting it concluded now is we have some ability to strategic plan. We have some ability to identify that we know that funding is coming. Some disadvantages associated with November timeframes, right? It is a little bit shorter of a time frame to educate voters on what it is we're spending the dollars on and what our needs are and what would be the impact if it wasn't passed. In March, you're going to see the alternate. You're going to see some advantages. We'll have a longer time frame, so we'll be able to have some good discussion and get clarity on what it is these dollars are using and how it is it's going to help the taxpayers. I put as a disadvantage, this is probably just because I'm a finance person, right? And so waiting until March does complicate the budget process a little bit. Not very much, but you know, it just means we might have to create 2 budgets. I don't want that to necessarily be deterrent from the process. Just know that that's kind of the process we go through. I think you guys are well versed on that, but we can do it. Our staff are well qualified and able to handle that. Supplemental levy language. A lot of the language is fairly consistent from what we had before. There's a couple of things to identify. Typically what we list in the language is the market rate per $100,000 of taxable assessed value. We don't actually know that yet. I'm going to have that conversation in a little bit when we talk about the L2 certification form, but we just haven't been published those numbers, so we're actually going to use what the number would have been last year. Talking with our legal team and the bond team, they felt like that was the most appropriate way and conservative route to have the language. And then there are some updated wording changes that's associated with legislative changes that occurred during the last session. What we do and how we draft this language, essentially bond counsel drafts it for us, and then we review it. The bond team, which many of them are people you met in June, from Zions and from Piper Sandler and from Holly Drexel. Questions on process and next steps?
Questions? Trustee Kloppenstein.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was curious if we're not going to be running if we're basically exchanging ESSER funds for emergency funds, and so we don't have the emergency levy. Does the legal language cross over so those things that we're supposed to be spending on, required to spend for emergency levy, are they also being spent then by ESSER funds, or is there some areas where ESSER funds just can't be spent for those sort of requirements, those sort of needs?
Madam Chair and trustees, there is some flexibility associated with the ESSER language, so it may not be we would use this expense for this expense, but essentially we would identify other expenses that would qualify under ESSER that would essentially mitigate the backfill. So it might not be, this was a dollar we were going to use on the emergency levy, and so now it's transferring over here, but it might be we look at shifting another dollar that we can utilize ESSER funding for, and that will help offset the emergency levy loss.
So if I can just ask, we're not like going to not do things because we're making this switch, is that correct?
Madam Chair and trustees, no.
Okay.
No. We'll be able to manage.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Mr. Gillen?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Trustee Kofel.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions. Is it okay if I just go into the second one?
Yeah, go for it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the information. I was wondering on, I believe it's the second page of the slide where it talks about some of the potential impacts if we did not get the supplemental levy, and you know, the staffing, those are fairly clear. There's one that talks about $1 million reduction in supply allocations. Can you give us an example of like what are some of those items that would be impacted by no levy?
Madam Chair and trustees, absolutely. This was actually on the list of things that we had to look at reducing the last time when the supplemental levy didn't pass in May. We do an allocation out to schools to be able to offset costs associated with what would be perhaps more supply-intensive programs such as science, and you know, science is usually a big one. There are some courses that usually require a lot of other consumables. And so essentially what happens is that allocation would go away. And so then what happens is other supply allocations the schools receive separate from that would just be stretched further. So we would be asking them to essentially stretch their dollars more than they would currently do. Currently they have the ability to be flexible and be able to meet all of those needs, and there would be certain things that they just wouldn't be able to purchase, right? We might not be able to run a certain science experiment because that might be a more costly supply input, and we wouldn't have the dollars to be able to allocate to the classroom to be able to do that. So we'd be asking our principals to be able to manage that budget a little tighter.
Great, thank you very much. A follow-up question. Does, and obviously it all comes down to, you know, the voters and the number of people that turn out, but does running this levy in a November ballot versus a March ballot that really is only for school district funding, is there an advantage to running it in one over the other?
Madam Chair and trustees, that always gets
Boy, Rusty, that's making him step in a landmine.
Madam Chair and trustees, I wish that I would be able to necessarily tell you about what it is that will help you. I mean, ideally, I think what you're going to look at is it's all about education and making sure people understand the expenses that we incur, and then them being able to make decisions as a voter. And so I wouldn't presume to be an expert to be able to tell you whether that could happen easier in November versus in March. I think either way we'll have some of those same conversations.
Thank you. Trustee Kofelt.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate the tough question. I was just asking from the sense that I would imagine in March there'd probably be a less voter turnout than in November, so that's where kind of my question was going, so thank you.
Last time we ran the supplemental levy, we ran it in May, and then we ran it in August. COVID was in place, and we had a absentee ballot structure set up for both, and actually had pretty similar turnout. And May was a primary, and August was what you would consider probably similar to March. So depending on how the voting structures are set up at that time could also impact it. Trustee Ozuna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Gillen, historically, if I remember correctly, the levy used to help fund some additional instructional days or maybe some professional development. Has that been worked into the budget now so that if the levy were to not pass, we don't lose those the instructional time and the professional development for our educators?
Madam Chair and trustees, so we always used to identify it based on days lost, and really I think we're just in a new situation now, right? We have the number of days we have in the contract, and so I don't really want to look at what we took away years ago versus really the impact that it would be now, right? And so I think when you talk about professional development funding, really the big impact of that has been really the reduction in the state allocation. It hasn't been so much the impact of the loss of the supplemental levy. We received state funding for professional development, and that was reduced in the past year. And so that's been the number one impact for that. For other things, really, we would look at decisions now as if we could make day adjustments. I mean, those will all be conversations we'd have to have separately. But really, the impact is going to be in some way our impact on personnel and probably an FTE reduction, quite honestly.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I want to thank you. At a time when we're getting a lot of federal funding in, it makes some sense to ease the burden on taxpayers. So coming forward and saying we don't need the emergency levy right now is awesome, because I don't think that typically happens in school districts. So I appreciate the conservative financial budgeting that you guys have put together in that case. So really thank you. That, I don't know that I've seen that happen before. Really appreciate it. On the supplemental levy portion of it, do you have more, Jonathan, or are we gonna, because I wanted to have some board discussion on the timing at some point in here.
I don't have any more unless you have questions for me. I can, essentially what you'll be approving tonight would be the language, which is built on moving forward in November. If we choose, if the board chooses to look at March, essentially we'll bring back language because we'll have additional information on market rates, and then we'll rehash kind of this conversation again at a later date. Usually, when you look at March timeline, typically the board would want to see that in December, just to give you some impact on timing.
Okay, okay.
Perfect.
I guess what I'm also asking is, we can move on to the L2 certification, but I still want to have a board discussion on timing, and because we got timing, the language will be impacted by the timing decision. So I wanted to kind of get a sense from the board on what you're thinking, if there's any other questions right now in the discussion period around where we might go from a timing standpoint, or where you're leaning from a timing standpoint on a supplemental levy, based on what you, I mean, we had a work session on this last board meeting or a couple meetings ago. So I'd like to hear from the board on what your thoughts are on timing. Trustee Kloppenstein.
Madam Chair, I appreciate that, be able to comment. I think actually the timing would be more appropriate for the November instead of the March, just because there is a possibility that the legislature may take away our March time, or may adjust some of the other election time. It might be better just to do it sooner than later, just because of that. So, my 2 cents.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I'm supportive of a November timeframe as well. I do think for budget and planning purposes that will look better. I can't recall us running the levy ever in November, and with more voter turnout, it will be interesting, but also good information for us to know how the community feels about this. I'm supportive of November.
Trustee Kofelt?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Trustee Ozuna and Trustee Kloppenstein, I would support the November timeframe. I think it gives us some better exposure to our voters. So hopefully we would be successful in November, but if not, it would have been put in front of them, and then we could just continue with some further informational with them. As Mr. Gillian points out, if we wait till March and it wasn't to pass, we could have some impacts to our planning, our both budgeting and strategic planning. And so, for those reasons, I would support the November timeframe.
Thank you. And Trustee Buffy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm supportive of the November ballot. And question, because if it's not successful in the November, we would be able to rerun it in March if we chose to.
That's correct. I think there was a bill last year around removing some election dates, but usually when that bill, unless it has an emergency clause on it and bill passes before the election filing time frame, it'd be really hard for March to not be possible too. It might be not possible to do in August or whatever, but for now I think we're okay with a November and a March, just based on legislative process. I'm also supportive of November. I think the more people that vote on these things, the better. So, and I think it's good data to have as well. So, and I think people support their schools, and their kids. So, with that, I think that will make that timing easy. Are you going to do the L2 form, Jonathan? You thought you were ready to run down.
Yes, I think I have, Mr. Myers is going to speak first before I.
Oh, okay.
Unless.
Oh, do I have something I missed? Oh, continuous improvement plan, sorry. I didn't know why we didn't put those together. So you want to get up and down?
Yeah, Madam Chair, and similar to Mr. Gill in fashion, I'm going to approach the podium up there so I can see the PowerPoint at the same time.
Perfect, thank you.
right, Madam Chair, Trustees, and Dr. Bubb. Tonight we get to take a look at the first draft of the Continuous Improvement Plan for the West Ada School District 21-22.
Mr. Myers, just because we have folks in the audience who probably don't know what, can you kind of just give a framework of, or context for what the continuous improvement plan is?
Absolutely. So, Madam Chair, with your permission, as we go through the PowerPoint, there are talking parts in the PowerPoint that talk about what it is, what it isn't, and then also reflects on the why and the purpose behind it. If I don't get to those parts and answer any of your questions, please let me know, okay? All right. First, the continuous improvement plan, what it is and what it isn't, and the why and the purpose behind this. Before we get started, I do want to thank a few folks who helped in the development of the continuous improvement plan, knowing that this truly is a West Ada team effort, reflecting the work of our wonderful teachers, our incredible students, and our staff, our administrators out there, knowing that this really does reflect the product of what, at the end of the year, those metrics that showed exactly where our students were at in their learning, also where we're headed toward in the next year, knowing that that is our end product and essentially where we're going to be. The process, though, in itself isn't described in the continuous improvement plan, but we'll talk about those details. In regards to thanking some people, I would like to thank Kelly Davies, who's the Administrator of Assessment and Accountability, Don Tolan, who's one of our council supervisors and staff members, Nikki Sheppers, who's our Community Liaison Coordinator, and the many leaders who assisted with the data analysis and creation of the document. First of all, the why and the purpose. The Continuous Improvement Plan is a goal-setting document for this upcoming school years that is required by the Idaho State Department of Education. It is an important and valuable document, but again, it talks about the product, what happens at the end of the year, and doesn't necessarily address the process. Regardless, though, it is a valuable documentation piece that we're required to have, as well as the other districts in the state of Idaho. It identifies academic achievement and proficiency with statewide metrics. Some of these statewide metrics include the ISAT, the IRI, graduation rate, SAT, those metrics that are common across all schools, public schools in the state of Idaho. It utilizes essentially 2 data points for each of these metrics, and typically that's spring to spring. So really it doesn't necessarily give us a picture of what happened over the course of the year. Essentially it says what happened last spring as compared to this upcoming spring. And lastly, it's intended to be an accountability document. And that's true for the West Ada School District, but it's also the state's requirement for their federal reporting as well. So the continuous improvement, here's what it is and here's what it is. And I'm just going to go through line by line and allude on some of these. But first, it is a yearly common reporting protocol for the state of Idaho. And we are required to report our end of year data as a result of that on this and display it publicly on our website. What it isn't is an ongoing collection of student achievement data. It is a reporting tool, but it is not a strategic planning tool, nor is it intended to be so. It does include previous year's data when it's applicable. Some of that data isn't there because of 2019 and the data that wasn't collected statewide on ISAT testing and some other standardized tests. And then it reflects the goals for those only. What it isn't is that it doesn't discuss processes by how West Ada will achieve those goals and those goals that were added to the SIP and everything that we do beyond just the metric spreadsheet. It is a one-time communication tool for stakeholders, meaning that we'll put it up here before October 1st, on or before October 1st, and then that document doesn't necessarily change until the following year on October 1st. It is not a progress reporting tool for our stakeholders. It does identify the product at the end of the year, and by product I mean the product of student achievement as measured by those statewide assessments, but it does not identify necessarily the process for that year. And the reason I want to talk specifically about what it is and what it isn't is because I just want to recall our conversation during a board work session where we talked about here how we as a district we're going to monitor the business of teaching and learning in West Ada through district-wide and systemic PLC processes, through our professional learning communities, where our school-based and district-based teams are continuously looking on typically an 8 to 10 week cycle student achievement benchmark data across all of our grade levels in ELA and math, okay? And so this next is a screenshot of essentially one portion of that SIP plan, and trustees, you were provided the entire SIP plan. What I do want to point out with this is that we did take the information contained in the spreadsheets that you can see in the SIP plan provided to you is essentially the template that was provided to us by the state. Now we can use the template or we can veer a little bit from that template given that the same information is provided. I do want to let you know that we used the template, we framed it and essentially through the lens of what a West Ada template would look like in regards to that as far as our branding. But at the same time, wanted to add small notes and narratives in regards to what is the process in as much as what is the product. And so that's what I want to talk about on this next slide, which is we did add this to the SIP plan. And to recall that, this is the information that we discussed at the board work session on August 10th. This is that purposely planned and very intentional structure of benchmark assessments in ELA, English Language Arts, and mathematics across all grade levels in the West Ada School District. So essentially what this says is, what is West Ada's process for ensuring that we meet the goals on our SIP plan as reported one time? But as a district, we are going to report these based on those date timelines that you see ahead there. And so we'll have those progress reporting. We'll have that data that allows us to make instructional changes on the fly throughout the course of the year, rather than waiting until the end. And so what are the next steps on the SIP plan? Well, should revisions be needed after tonight, it will be added to the board meeting agenda on September 27th. Input from the trustees this evening I'll take to the CIP committee and return that with any revisions needed on the 27th. We do have a due date that's required by the State Department to post on the West Ada website by October 1st. I do want you to know that our fantastic Mr. Stevens here has already started some of that work, knowing that is draft. That way, when we are ready for that on or before October 1st, we can make that happen on the website there. I speak as if that is just a magical flip of the switch, but Troy is working very hard at making that happen for us. It does, our next steps as well is for us to continue our systemic PLC academic monitoring process. I do want you to know that we're currently in our first benchmarking window now. That's very exciting. Essentially what that equates to is us playing a scrimmage before a very big game at the end of the year, seeing where our students are at, where our teams are at, where our teachers are at instructionally in order to make some instructional changes. That's followed up with our first district leadership team meeting, our second district leadership team meeting on September 27th, where essentially there are about 150 of us that meet in collaborative teams across the district and make short-term goal decisions, common strategies to address student learning needs, and then ways in which to monitor those strategies using combative assessments that way. And so essentially we remove the idea of learning by chance, and we learn by planning, by intentionality, and that we're always going back and reflecting on our long-term goals, which is what's included on the SIP, knowing that our short-term goals and processes are, by the way, in which we're going to get there. So with that information, I know that was quick. I'd be more than happy to stand for any questions or revision opportunities we have as I take it back to the committee later this week.
Thank you. Is there any questions, comments? I have a couple. You had the ELA on here, but we also have one for the mathematics, that assessment and that same process for mathematics. Is
Yes,
that correct?
Chairwoman Johnson, on the full SIP plan that you received, that ELA and mathematics are on there. Just for the examples on the board presentation here, I left those off just for
I thought
conversation's sake.
I actually had the chance to go tour and go into Mountain View High School last Friday, and I spent some time in there, and I went into classrooms, and I went into a classroom where they were working on moving students who were behind grade level in math up, and the teacher showed me the assessment data, the grade level that they were at, so where they were testing from a mathematics standpoint, and then where they were actually at in their grade, and then what she was doing with the class to move them from being behind to moving towards being at grade level or above. And it was awesome from the data and the look, how she was working with the kids. So that level of rigor and structure and the kids, their responses to it was really, really phenomenal. And I just wanted to say, besides the fact that you just worked on this over the summer, it's up and running already is great. Proves you were the right guy for the job.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have a tremendous number of incredible students and teachers out there who are getting the work done, and administrators who, through that level of clarity, the celebration that you have with us right this evening, within this benchmark window and within the course of the year, we're all celebrating together on very common terms with very common language. Because just from the conversation you had and the short summary of what you shared, what happened at Mountain View, we know that that's taking place across all of our schools in West Ada as well. So it is a good celebration to have, so thank you.
Yeah, it was awesome. It's refreshing to see where we're impacting education, because I think that's why all of us signed up for this job. The other piece of my question is really, and it's probably more to Clerk Newbold and Dr. Bubb than you, is can we schedule now, those board meetings or after those quarterly reviews, for the board to get an update from you on each, as our progress as we move throughout the year. So I just want to put those on the agenda for now so we can get that information, just so we have it scheduled out, because I think it'll be helpful to see the progress and track through, and you guys can tell us where you're making adjustments, and we can understand better how to help, so.
Madam Chair, a communications plan for all of our stakeholders, including the board, our teachers, our students, and for our families is part of that process as well, and falls within these timeframes that are outlined.
Thank you. Trustee Kofelt, did you have something?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just a couple quick comments, and to piggyback a little bit with what you said is I'm happy to see, obviously our math scores are not where we want them to be. And, you know, we talked at length about this at our workshop, and then it's also in the plan that the purposeful plan for improvement with our math programs. And so I'm really excited about that. And then I'm also excited about what you had touched on with the benchmarking and this very purposeful and in-depth process of support and coaching and benchmarking on a quarterly basis to kind of identify if there's gaps somewhere early on, and then provide the support both to the staff and the students so that everybody's successful. I'm really excited about that, and I appreciate the effort that the staff has put into making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one thing that the teacher said to me when I was in there that I thought was really interesting. So it was I think sophomore level class, or quite a few sophomores and freshmen in there. She said when she was working with the kids, she said, I gave the kids a choice. So obviously she's going to get up and teach for a portion of the class time. And then they had a portion of the class time where they could work on homework. They could there's some computer training that goes into that. And then there's also some games, I guess. And she asked the kids what priority did they want to work through those 4 different areas. And because they wouldn't get to everything every class. And the kids came back with, we want help. We want to do obviously instructions first, but homework second, because a number of those kids didn't have access to somebody to help them when they were doing homework at home to understand where they were missing on the math. And that really raised a pretty kind of heads up in there. And the other thing, and I made a connection from something else that you've shared with us, Mr. Myers, in the past, and Dr. Bubb, which is we're looking at a tool for families and students through some of our ESSER funding to have access to an immediate tutor to help with those things outside of the classroom when a kid is at home working on their homework at 8 o'clock at night. And it just made so much, like it really filled the gap. That tool will really fill the gap in those situations because right now the students didn't have access to somebody to help them when they were doing that unless they were in class. So I don't know if you guys have heard that. I'm assuming you have, but I thought that was a really good connection point for us, also investing in some technology that will help support the teacher and the student in moving towards those learning goals.
Yeah, Madam Chair, the 2 pieces to that. The first is student ownership of learning, right? So that student reaching out and saying, I need help with this because this is where I know I need to go in my learning, and then I don't have an ability to access those tools in order to get there when I'm at home. So one, that's a celebration in of itself. The second piece is providing that resource for our students. The proposed resources in the ESSER plan, where the plan was to provide that learning tool and that opportunity that you alluded to and what you had said, that continues to be underway. There is a vendor process with that and a purchasing process with that, and we're working with the State Department in order to open up some of those avenues for us, knowing that regardless we're going to go there. One way is just an easier path, and the other way takes a little more time. And so to get that tool in the hands of our students as soon as possible, I know that my friend Jonathan Gillen's working on that with the State Department as well. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think if you have feedback on the SIP plan, if we didn't get it in the meeting here, if you guys would provide it to Mr. Myers before we review again on the 27th, that'd be great.
Thank you.
And now we'll do the L2 tax certification form.
Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Bubb. So you got a little break. Now I'm back to talk more about finance. So let's get started. So what is the L2 form? I'll kind of walk through what it is and why we do this process. So we talked just briefly about the supplemental levy, the process by which voters go through and approve that. The L2 form is actually the mechanism by which we actually levy those taxes. And so what happens is there's a bunch of data inputs that go into it. I'm going to show you just one of the tabs, essentially the one that calculates the levy amounts. But there are other tabs we go through, and then that data goes to the county and then goes to the state, and then that's how it actually works onto the property tax rolls itself. So you're going to see a picture of the L2 form that's got basically our inputs in it. I'm going to walk through each of the dollar amounts that will be on it. Other inputs we'll talk about changes from previous year, and then I was hoping that today I would be able to give you what I think the levy rate is going to be. We're just waiting on market values, so unfortunately you're going to get a TBD on that, and that information will come. The way it works is that information filters from the state and from the counties to our folks, and then I get a copy of it so they can use it. So, and it just hasn't happened yet. So what you see before you is the L2 form itself. This is the document that we're going to use to levy. It is a little different than in past years. The state has changed the form this year, so it looks a little different. I'm sure you probably don't remember what it looked like last year. I do, because I stare at this form a lot. So essentially, the different dollar amounts we're going to go through are all, in this case, since we're not doing an emergency levy, they're all already been voter approved, or allowable in statute, which you'll see with the tort towards the bottom. So the $14 million that'll be levying, that'll be the second year of our supplemental. The bonds that we have is essentially the debt. It is broken down between pre and post 2008. There was some changes in state law associated with urban renewal and how that calculates out, and so it's just really an effect on the levy rate itself and the calculations, so we're asked to separate those two out. And so, but that is for our current debt service, and so that's essentially debt that's already been approved by voters. We've already built the buildings, and now we're paying back to bondholders. The facility levy, that's $16 million, that was approved, that's a 10-year levy, it was approved in 2017. And then the tort, you'll see way down at the bottom, unfortunately I didn't build that form, I would have put it up a little higher so it'd be all in one place, is allowed under statute so we can levy dollar amounts associated with offsetting costs for our insurance. So these are amounts to be levied. What goes into the actual calculation are the change in market values. So the assessor came and spoke in May and talked about a big market value increase, and so that will have a downward effect on our levy rate. Essentially, they work in connection together. And then the other inputs are essentially a calculation of our debt service. You're going to see that number is roughly right around 30.9 million. That number should sound a little familiar if you live the world that I live in. That's almost the same number we talked about in June when we talked about our bonds. So basically, you're going to see that process that we went through work its way through. Again, the supplemental is 14, facilities are 16, and the tort is 496. So I tried to identify the changes year over year. So tort levy changes was roughly a $60,000 increase. That changes each year just based on market values. So that will change annually. The judgment levy, last year we collected one of those. This year we're not. So essentially the way the judgment levy works is if the counties make an adjustment to, usually it's a business entity's taxes, essentially the following year they will send us something saying, school district, you can level a judgment levy, which is an additional dollar amount associated with the dollars we didn't capture at that time. So really we weren't notified of any judgment levy, so we weren't notified of any adjustments, and so we won't be levying that. That is every year the counties will provide me with notification if we exist, and if it doesn't, then it comes off. The large reduction you're going to see is in the bonds associated with our debt service. So last year we levied right around $40 million associated with our debt service. We anticipate this year our debt service to be around $30.9 million. So you're going to see that's a substantial chunk of the overall reduction. That's going to be impacting what we're levying this year. We're going from 70 million total last year to 61 million. So you can see the overall reduction of 9 million, and the supplemental and plant are essentially the same as they were in previous years. So levy rate estimate, as of right now, I can tell you that that's what our market value is. I think it will probably adjust upward. Usually we get one last upward adjustment. The numbers will come out sometime this week. Really what you need to know is usually I provide an estimate of the levy rate, but we don't, as a district, we don't actually set that. We levy dollar amounts, and then the county or the state actually provides us what the levy rate is. Usually I try to give you kind of my inside of what I think it's going to be. Last year, I think I told you 245 and we ended at 237, so there's always a little bit of give there. This year, we just haven't got the rates yet, so I kept hoping today they would show up and I could run a quick calc, but it just didn't happen. So my apologies for that. And so questions. Essentially what would happen as part of this process is you go through and approve, I could do this faster with a keyboard, this document as presented. And then we'll go through the process of I will send it on over to the county. There's some other documents that I provide with them, a publication of our budget. And then that's what tells them that we're allowed to assess the dollar amounts and levy the dollars. And then that flows through on property tax forms in November. With that, I can stand for questions.
Thank you. Is there any questions or comments? I have one. Just do the math for me. $2.37 per 100,000?
It's $237, so if you had a $300,000 house, you're probably talking I should be able to do that math in my head, $700, roughly even.
Okay.
Yeah.
So $600 or $700 is what the taxpayer would pay?
Yeah, and so really when you think about it as a taxpayer, your inputs are, right, our dollar amount that we levy, and then the other effects are the assessment on their home, right, the portion that we don't necessarily have control over. And so that will all flow through as part of the calculation of what they see. And so sometimes they're able to compare last year or not, and sometimes just the change in assessments makes it a little more difficult to walk through that calc.
Okay, great, thank you. Trustee Kofelt, I didn't check in with him, and he can't raise his hand, so.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I'm good. I appreciate the presentation, and thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
All right, that moves us to the action portion of the agenda. And the first item up for action is a supplemental levy timeframe. And so with that, open it up for the board for motions. Trustee Buffy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move that the board places the supplemental levy on the November ballot.
Thank you. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded that the board place the supplemental levy renewal up on the November ballot. Is there any discussion? I think we discussed a little earlier, so seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Chair votes aye, motion carries 5-0. The next item up is the supplemental levy language. And I would entertain a motion for that. Trustee Kloppenstein.
Madam Chair, I would move that we approve the supplemental language as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or questions? I want to make sure with Mr. Gillen that our motion will give you what you need on the language. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Seeing no additional discussions or questions, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 And chair votes aye, motion carries 5-0. And the last action item up is the L2 tax certification form. Is there a motion? Trustee Ozuna.
Madam Chair, I would move that we approve the L2 tax certification form.
Thank you. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded that we approve the L2 tax certification form. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Chair votes aye, motion carries 5-0. We have up now the consent agenda. I appreciate we've adjusted our agenda structure so the consent agenda is at the very end or after our discussion and action. So with that, I would entertain any motions on the consent agenda. Trustee Buffy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move that the board approve the consent agenda as presented.
Thank you. Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded that the board approve the consent agenda as presented. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Chair votes aye, motion carries 5-0. The next item up on our agenda is future agenda items, and this is where if we have something we want to get on the future agenda, I hope Clerk Newbold will keep track of the requests, but we always open it up for a board to ask for additional items on the agenda at this point. And if we don't have any, Trustee Ozuna.
Madam Chair, thank you. We got notification from Dr. Bub and Mr. Gillen about the challenges that we've had with Cascade Transportation this year. I think an update on our busing situation, maybe a strategic conversation about where we are and maybe what opportunities we have going forward would be helpful.
Thank you. It's a good suggestion. Is there any others? All right, then we'll move into Section E, the action item for the board to move into executive session, and the language is on here for the motion maker to read. So with that, I'll open it up for a motion. Trustee Buffy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would move that we enter executive session per Idaho Code 74206 1B to consider the evaluation, dismissal, or disciplining of, or to hear complaints or charges brought against a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent or public school student.
Thank you. Is there a second? Second. It's been moved and seconded that the board move into executive session as read. This is a roll call vote, so I'm going to call your name and we'll go from there. Trustee Kofelt?
Aye.
Trustee Buffy? Aye. Trustee Ozuna?
Aye.
Trustee Kloppenstein? Aye. And the chair votes aye. Motion carries 5-0, and the board will move into executive session. Thank you. All right, the board returns from executive session at 8:49 p.m. And the next up is, option is adjournment.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded by trustee Ozuna that we adjourn the meeting. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Chair votes aye, motion carries 5-0, we're adjourned.